September 1944. The Allied advance across France and Belgium was so rapid it outran its own supply lines, leading to a critical logistical crisis. The capture of the massive port of Antwerp on September 4th was a major strategic victory, but the port itself remained entirely useless because German forces controlled the 70-mile-long Scheldt estuary leading from the North Sea inland. This created an immediate, catastrophic bottleneck for the entire Western Front. Compelling evidence. The Allied armies were consuming an estimated 25,000 to 30,000 tons of supplies per day. But without Antwerp, they were reliant on tenuous, long truck convoys stretching back to the Normandy beachheads and smaller ports, a logistical system that was rapidly failing. Opening Antwerp, which could handle 40,000 tons per day, was recognized by General Eisenhower as the #1 strategic imperative of the moment, overriding all other immediate offensive plans. Insightful expert, quote, "The task of clearing the estuary fell primarily to the 1st Canadian Army, a multinational force operating under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, which faced the entrenched German 15th Army, General Gustav Adolf von Zengen. This German army, skillfully evacuated from France after the Falaise Gap, was fresh, well-supplied, and prepared to fight a ruthless defensive battle." Vivid example. The German defense was anchored on the South Beveland Peninsula and Walcheren Island, controlling every navigable channel, and heavily fortified with coastal artillery batteries, known as heavy flak batteries, repurposed for anti-ship defense, that made naval clearance impossible until the land was secure. The rich explanation for the urgency is the statistical reality that without a major port, the massive offensive into Germany, including the upcoming push into the Siegfried Line, would simply starve of fuel and ammunition, making the Scheldt a strategic choke point that determined the end of the war. The immense pressure on the Canadian command was absolute, confirming that securing a port was now more critical than capturing territory. The battle was immediately defined by the horrific terrain of the Scheldt estuary, a natural defensive system of mud, water, and saturated land that minimized the Allied advantage in armor and air power. Compelling evidence. The battleground consisted largely of low-lying polders, land reclaimed from the sea and protected by dikes. The German defenders were masters at breaching these dikes, creating deliberate, massive engineered flooding that turned the terrain into vast, shallow, impassable lakes of thick, sucking mud. This deliberately flooded, flat landscape provided no cover for advancing infantry and nullified the Allies' massive numerical superiority in tanks and armored vehicles, forcing the fighting back to infantry-centric, slow-motion attrition. Insightful expert, quote, "The German forces, primarily the elite Fallschirmjäger paratroopers and experienced infantry from the 15th Army, utilized the deep network of ditches, dikes, and causeways as natural fortifications, creating interlocking fields of fire that made any frontal assault agonizingly costly." Vivid example. Initial Canadian attacks, attempting to use conventional infantry and tank support, sank immediately into the glutinous mud between the dikes, suffering devastating casualties from hidden German machine gun nests and mortar fire that rained down from the slight elevation of the dikes themselves. The rich explanation for the high casualties is the German doctrinal brilliance in exploiting terrain. They understood the strategic advantage of forcing the mechanized Allied army into a static, infantry-only engagement on ground of the Germans' choosing, maximizing the defensive lethality and the attritional statistical reality of the battle. The Scheldt became an agonizing, muddy killing field where every yard of flooded ground was purchased at a terrible cost. The first phase of the operation focused on clearing the area south of the estuary, known as the Breskins Pocket, requiring the use of specialized amphibious assault units and new tactical doctrines. Compelling evidence. The operation, codenamed Operation Switchback, required the Canadian 3rd Division and the British 52nd Lowland Division to assault the pocket across multiple river crossings and flooded zones. This terrain demanded the use of specialized amphibious equipment. The success of this phase hinged entirely on the Allied employment of WW2 Water Buffalo, amphibious landing vehicles, tracked vehicles capable of traversing both water and the thick mud of the polders, the only vehicle capable of moving men across the flooded zones. Insightful expert, quote, "The fighting in the pocket was marked by the brutal effectiveness of the German defense, particularly the fierce resistance from the 64th Infantry Division. Every small village, dike crossing, and cluster of farmhouses was transformed into a miniature fortress requiring house-to-house fighting." Vivid example. Canadian troops frequently resorted to using Wasp flamethrower carriers, universal carriers equipped with flamethrowers, to literally burn German paratroopers out of deeply entrenched positions in the dikes, demonstrating the extreme measures required to achieve tactical breakthroughs. The rich explanation for the specialized assault is the technological imperative. Conventional tanks were useless. The only way to deliver firepower to the besieged infantry was through these specialized, low-profile amphibious vehicles, confirming a crucial shift in combined arms doctrine for the terrain. Operation Switchback was a victory of specialized technology and unrelenting infantry attrition, clearing the southern flank but still leaving the estuary closed. The next major obstacle was the South Beveland Peninsula, a narrow strip of land that connected Walcheren Island to the mainland, requiring a brutal frontal assault across extremely narrow, bottlenecked terrain. Compelling evidence. The peninsula was less than 4 miles wide at its base, forcing the advancing Canadian and British troops into a compressed, head-on assault against the prepared German defenses, which had excellent crossfire coverage from both flanks. The tactical plan required the Canadian 2nd Division to push directly down the peninsula's narrow causeways and dikes, which were heavily mined and zeroed in by German artillery, minimizing the Allied ability to maneuver or flank the enemy. Insightful expert. Quote, "The advance was agonizingly slow, often measured in yards per hour. The Canadian forces were forced to repeatedly clear and hold the narrow dikes against relentless German counterattacks, which were often launched at night to deny the Allies the advantage of air support." Vivid example. Engineers had to precede the infantry, crawling under fire to clear sophisticated S-mine anti-personnel fields and T-mine anti-tank ditches. The concentration of mines was so severe that it guaranteed high casualty rates even before the engagement with German troops began. The rich explanation for the brutal attrition is the German doctrine of defense in depth on narrow fronts. By compressing the battlefield, they forced the Allies into predictable, high-casualty frontal assaults, maximizing the effectiveness of their limited manpower and conserving their ammunition. The relentless fighting on the South Beveland Peninsula became a sheer test of endurance and logistical resupply capability for the Canadian forces. The final, decisive stage of the battle focused on the heavily fortified Walcheren Island, which guarded the actual entrance to the estuary, requiring a complex, tri-pronged assault combining amphibious landings, a frontal attack, and strategic flooding. Compelling evidence. Walcheren Island was a German fortress, protected by massive concrete gun emplacements, part of the Atlantic Wall defenses that controlled the shipping channels. The German High Command considered the island impregnable due to its natural defenses and powerful coastal batteries. The Allied solution was a massive engineering gamble. The Royal Air Force, Royal Air Fleet, deliberately breached the massive seawalls and dikes of the island, using heavy bombers to create 4 huge gaps which flooded the island and incapacitated most of the internal defenses. Insightful expert. Quote, "The plan was audacious. The resulting flooding confined the German defenders to the high ground and the fortified villages, but it also forced the Allies to rely exclusively on specialized amphibious vehicles, LVTs and DUKWs for transport and assault, necessitating Operation Infatuate." Vivid example. The final assault involved an amphibious landing, Operation Infatuate I by British Royal Marines, and a second landing, Infatuate II, supported by the Canadian 52nd Division, who attacked across the single remaining causeway after the mainland had been secured. The rich explanation for the strategic flooding is the need to neutralize the massive coastal artillery. The water neutralized the land-based infantry defenses and isolated the German gun batteries, making them vulnerable to direct assault from the sea and air, validating the immense risk of flooding the island. The massive effort confirmed the strategic value of Antwerp, concluding one of the most difficult and bloody logistical battles of the Western Front. The final, high-cost battle for Walcheren Island necessitated a calculated engineering risk, the deliberate destruction of the island's seawalls by massive Allied bombing, a drastic measure to neutralize the German coastal guns. Compelling evidence. The primary German defense on Walcheren consisted of formidable concrete Atlantic Wall coastal batteries, including heavy 200mm guns, capable of dominating the entire estuary. These were impervious to conventional ground assault. The Allied solution was to deploy the Royal Air Force RAF to breach the island's massive dikes at 4 strategic points, flooding the island's interior. This unprecedented act of environmental warfare was a necessary command decision to save thousands of Allied lives. Insightful expert. Quote, "The strategic flooding accomplished 2 critical objectives. It washed out the German land-based defenses in the low-lying areas, and it isolated the heavy gun emplacements onto small patches of high ground, making them vulnerable to attack from the sea and air. Vivid example. The bombing created massive gaps through which the tide surged, turning the interior of Walcheren into a vast, shallow lake, forcing the German defenders to withdraw to the few remaining fortified villages and gun batteries. The rich explanation for the strategic flooding is that without neutralizing the coastal batteries, the mine-clearing naval vessels required to open the port would have been immediately destroyed, confirming the environmental assault as a critical prerequisite for the entire operation. The flooding was a brutal act of expediency, turning the island's defense into a fight for isolated sinking strongpoints. The specialized amphibious assault on Walcheren Island, codenamed Operation Infatuate, involved a complex tri-pronged attack that demonstrated the height of Allied logistical and technological coordination. Compelling evidence. The assault utilized two main prongs: Infatuate I, an amphibious landing by British Royal Marine Commandos attacking the strong point of Vlissingen-Flushing, and Infatuate II, a landing near the port of Westkapelle, targeting the largest German batteries. The success of both landings depended entirely on specialized amphibious equipment. Landing vehicles tracked LVTs, known as Buffaloes, and WKWs, Willeke amphibious trucks, the only vehicles capable of navigating the flooded, heavily mined beaches and mud. Insightful expert, quote, "The assault units were supported by the 79th Armored Division's specialized vehicles, including Funnies' flamethrowers and engineer tanks brought in via landing craft. This confirmed the necessity of specialized armor for breaching the island's formidable defenses." Vivid example. The initial landing at Westkapelle required the Royal Marines to silence the immense concrete coastal batteries at point-blank range, a feat achieved with support from Allied warships and specialized LVT tank fire, confirming the combined arms nature of the assault. The rich explanation for the complex assault is the difficulty of fighting an enemy protected by massive, pre-sited fortifications. The Allies had to attack simultaneously from the land and sea to divide the German defenders' attention and prevent the batteries from concentrating fire. Operation Infatuate was a logistical masterpiece, proving that complex technology was required to overcome the German fortifications. The German defense, anchored by the 15th Army, was characterized by experienced, well-equipped troops and a determined, high-casualty strategy that prolonged the Scheldt operation into a brutal war of attrition. Compelling evidence. The German forces, skillfully evacuated from the Falaise pocket weeks earlier, included the tenacious 64th Infantry Division and highly capable elements of the Fallschirmjäger paratroopers. These were not raw recruits, but hardened veterans prepared for static, high-cost defense. General Gustav Adolf von Zangens. Troops were ordered to hold the estuary at all costs, understanding that closing Antwerp was their most critical contribution to the overall defense of the Reich in the West. Insightful expert, quote, "The fierce resistance was often driven by a sense of tactical superiority over the terrain. The German defenders maximized the use of flooded ditches and dikes, forcing the Allied forces into open, predictable channels of attack." Vivid example. German positions were often fortified with concrete and hidden log bunkers, making them immune to most Allied shelling and requiring Canadian and British troops to use extreme close-quarters tactics, including grenades and flamethrowers, to clear them one by one. The rich explanation for the German resolve is the logistical imperative. The Germans understood that the defense of the Scheldt was a defense of their industrial heartland, the Ruhr, making the fighting desperate and minimizing the rate of surrender until the last possible moment. The German defense was brilliant and costly, forcing the Allies to pay a devastating human price for every foot of mud. The sheer scale of the Allied casualties confirmed the statistical reality of the battle as one of the costliest engagements of the Western Front, emphasizing the human price of solving the supply crisis. Compelling evidence. The 5-week battle resulted in over 12,800 Allied casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, with the Canadian forces bearing the brunt of the losses, confirming the high price of the frontal assaults across the difficult terrain. The sheer density of the German defenses, combined with the catastrophic impact of minefields and deliberate flooding, ensured that every tactical objective, from a dike to a village, was purchased at the cost of lives. Insightful expert, quote, "The Canadian Army alone sustained over 6,300 casualties in the relentless offensive. This high attrition rate was a direct consequence of the brutal, close-quarters infantry fighting dictated by the restrictive terrain." Vivid example. The fighting was characterized by high attrition breakthroughs rather than maneuver. The troops had to literally crawl through mud and water under intense mortar fire to eliminate well-concealed German machine gun nests positioned on the high ground of the dikes. The rich explanation for the high casualties is the strategic inevitability. The Allies had to clear the Scheldt. The Germans knew the Allies had to clear the Scheldt. This knowledge led to a fixed, ruthless defense with a guaranteed high statistical cost for the attacker. The Scheldt became an emblem of necessary sacrifice, confirming the immense human cost of the logistical solution. The pivotal role of engineered flooding by the Germans served as a masterstroke of tactical defense, forcing the Allied command to develop and implement new forms of combined arms warfare. Compelling evidence. The German defense systematically used the Dutch and Belgian dikes to inundate the land, a defensive measure that instantly negated the Allies' overwhelming advantage in armor, artillery mobility, and truck transport. This deliberate flooding forced the Allies into specialized logistical dependency. Every shell, meal, and casualty evacuation had to be transported by vulnerable amphibious vehicles, LVTs, and STUKWs, slowing the pace of the entire operation. Insightful expert, quote, "The German use of water and mud as a weapon was a direct tactical response to Allied mechanization. It reduced the massive offensive power of the Allied armored divisions to the pace and vulnerability of a walking infantryman." Vivid example. The successful clearance of the Breskens Pocket, Operation Switchback, was only possible because of the large-scale deployment of the Buffalo, LVTs, confirming that the German flooding dictated the entire Allied equipment manifest and tactical approach for weeks. The rich explanation for the German success in using water is their understanding of the landscape. They leveraged the polder system land designed to be flooded to create a defense in depth where the main obstacle was the terrain itself, protected by German fire. The German strategic flooding transformed the battlefield into a logistical and tactical nightmare for the Allies. The final, high-stakes combat for the Walcheren Island coastal batteries confirmed the decisive role of British Royal Marines and specialized armor in neutralizing the formidable fixed defenses of the Atlantic Wall. Compelling evidence. The two major amphibious assaults, Operation Infatuate I and II, were carried out primarily by highly trained Royal Marine commandos. Their mission was close quarters, high-risk neutralization of the massive concrete bunkers and coastal guns. The success of the beach landings hinged on the overwhelming fire support provided by specialized funnies, engineered tanks, and Allied craft gun LCGG vessels, which engaged the bunkers at point-blank range to cover the assault waves. Insightful expert quote, "The Royal Marines were selected for their expertise in amphibious landings and urban fortress combat, skills deemed necessary to breach the deep, layered defenses of the German gun batteries." Vivid example. The LVT, landing vehicle tracked, played a vital dual role, serving as the primary transport for the Marines across the flooded beaches and acting as mobile armored vehicles capable of delivering heavy machine gun fire to suppress the German infantry. The rich explanation for the commandos' success is the isolation caused by the strategic flooding. The water neutralized the internal German land defenses, forcing the gun crews to fight alone against determined amphibious assault and heavy naval fire support. The final assault on Walcheren was a perfect synergy of specialized forces and overwhelming firepower to breach the Atlantic Wall. The entire battle was a profound illustration of the prioritization of logistics over maneuver, where the strategic goal was a port, not a city, fundamentally altering the Allied offensive doctrine. Compelling evidence. The immense political and military pressure exerted by General Eisenhower to open Antwerp confirmed the disastrous impact of the lengthening supply lines running from Normandy. The Scheldt operation was not about gaining ground toward Germany. It was about securing the logistical heart necessary to sustain all future ground operations, transforming the battle into a high-cost engineering and clearance project. Insightful expert quote, "Field Marshal Montgomery was initially criticized for focusing on the Scheldt instead of pursuing the retreating German forces immediately after the Falaise Gap. However, the subsequent supply crisis validated the strategic necessity of the port." Vivid example. The statistical reality of the supply shortage meant that frontline units were rationing gasoline and ammunition, directly limiting their operational capacity and confirming the immediate need for a deep-water port like Antwerp. The rich explanation for the logistical pivot is the sheer size of the Allied army. Moving millions of men and their equipment required a sustained supply flow that land transport alone could not provide, making the port a non-negotiable strategic asset. The relentless fight for the Scheldt was the costliest solution to the Western Front's greatest logistical crisis. The crucial role played by Canadian engineer and technical units confirmed the high technological and industrial demands of overcoming the Germans' water-based defensive masterstroke. Compelling evidence. The dense minefields deployed by the Germans, including sophisticated anti-personnel S-mines and anti-tank T-mines, had to be cleared by Canadian engineer teams working continuously under fire across the saturated dikes and flooded fields. The subsequent naval clearance of the estuary, after the land battles were won, required hundreds of Canadian and British minesweepers to remove over 2,000 naval mines that had been laid by the German Navy, a massive and perilous operation. Insightful expert, quote, "The engineers were considered the true heroes of the attrition, facing the highest non-combat casualty rates as they worked to breach German strongpoints and clear the extensive minefields that paralyzed Allied movement. Vivid example. The use of specialized equipment, such as flamethrower carriers, wasps, and improvised assault boats, demonstrated the engineering solutions required to counter the Germans' water-based fortifications and breach the deeply entrenched positions. The rich explanation for the engineers' importance is that the terrain and mines were the primary obstacles. Until the engineers cleared the route and breached the flooding, the infantry and armor could not engage the enemy effectively, confirming the battle's dependency on technical expertise. The Canadian engineers paid a high price for the breakthrough, confirming the battle was won by technical skill as much as by fighting spirit. The eventual defeat of the German forces led to a brief but critical strategic gap for the Allies, providing them a window of opportunity before the German counteroffensive at the Ardennes. Compelling evidence. The German 15th Army, though severely battered and having suffered significant losses, successfully delayed the opening of the port for 5 weeks, a strategic success that severely hampered Allied preparations for the winter. The delay meant that the port of Antwerp was not fully operational until November 28, 1944, weeks later than planned, giving the German High Command crucial time to stockpile resources and prepare the counteroffensive that became the East Battle of the Bulge, Ardennes Offensive. Insightful expert, quote, "The heavy attrition suffered by the Canadian and British forces at the Scheldt meant they were not immediately available for the frontline defense when the German counterattack hit the Ardennes in December." Vivid example. While the port's eventual opening relieved the logistical crisis, the delay allowed the German defensive lines along the Siegfried Line to solidify, guaranteeing a costly winter campaign for the Allies in the coming months. The rich explanation for the German strategic success is their effective use of the delaying action. By holding Antwerp unusable for weeks, they bought invaluable time for the rest of the German forces to regroup and prepare the counter-thrust that shocked the Allies in December. The cost of the Scheldt was paid twice, once in lives and again in the surprise of the Ardennes counterattack. The Battle of the Scheldt stands as a unique and grim testament to the attritional power of the defensive in a war that was largely defined by maneuver and speed. Compelling evidence. The relentless 5-week-long battle confirmed that even with overwhelming superiority in air power, armor, and manpower, a well-entrenched, determined enemy using terrain brilliantly can inflict disproportionate casualties and severely delay strategic objectives. The entire operation was a methodical, painful process of eliminating isolated pockets of tenacious German resistance, highlighting the high cost of fighting a fixed enemy on ground of their choosing. Insightful expert, quote, "The battle confirmed the ultimate strategic reality that logistics dictates war pace. The fight was not for territory but for throughput capacity, making the seemingly small victories of clearing dikes and small villages strategically immense." Vivid example. The successful clearance of the estuary on November 8th, followed by the port's official opening on November 28th, finally relieved the logistical choke point, confirming the strategic necessity of the entire bloody operation. The rich explanation for the battle's legacy is its lack of glory, but immense importance. It was an essential, unglamorous battle that saved the main Allied offensive from paralysis, a necessary sacrifice that ensured the eventual victory on the Western Front. The Battle of the Scheldt remains a somber example of attrition as strategic necessity. The complexity of the battle required a new level of command integration, particularly between ground forces and the massive Allied air power, which was used for strategic rather than merely tactical support. Compelling evidence. The Royal Air Force RAF and USAAF were used not just for close air support, but for deliberate strategic engineering, the breaching of the Walcheren dikes. This marked a profound shift in the use of air power to destroy the enemy's terrain-based defenses. The success of Operation Infatuatus was fundamentally dependent on the RAF's ability to create massive holes in the seawalls, disabling the German defense system and confining defenders to small areas of high ground. Insightful expert quote, "The air war over the Scheldt was dominated by ground attack fighters and fighter bombers, which provided immediate, localized close air support, CAS, to the infantry struggling through the mud, often proving to be the only effective counter to the concealed German machine. Gun nests. Vivid example. The CAS was vital during the fighting on the South Beveland Peninsula, where the Canadian infantry, pinned down on the narrow dikes, needed precision strikes against German positions that were impervious to frontal shelling. The rich explanation for the joint effort is that the ground conditions nullified the effectiveness of massed artillery in many areas. Air power became the only viable, heavy artillery, capable of suppressing the entrenched German positions and facilitating the slow infantry advance. The use of air power as an engineer and artillery piece confirmed a new level of combined arms reliance. The final, high-cost battle for Walcheren Island confirmed the unique challenges posed by the German Atlantic Wall fortifications, forcing the Allies to adopt a unique combined arms breaching doctrine. Compelling evidence. Walcheren was a formidable fortress, protected by thick-walled concrete coastal batteries that controlled the estuary entrance. These batteries were immune to anything less than direct, sustained naval or heavy artillery fire. The Allies utilized a specialized, dedicated fleet of landing craft gun, LCG, and landing craft tank, LCT vessels, which mounted heavy naval guns and rocket launchers to engage the German bunkers at near point-blank range to cover the Royal Marine landings. Insightful expert quote, "The engagement became a classic demonstration of breaching doctrine, using massive concentrated fire from the sea to suppress and neutralize fixed defenses while specialized amphibious forces closed in for the assault." Vivid example. The Royal Marine Commandos landing at West Capelle were supported by repeated heavy shelling from Allied warships, which delivered the sustained, accurate fire necessary to penetrate the thick concrete of the main German batteries. The rich explanation for the naval support is the overwhelming size of the German guns. Without the fire of Allied warships, the landing craft and the subsequent infantry assault would have been instantly annihilated upon entering the estuary's waters. Operation Infatuate was a successful application of massive sea-air-land coordination to break through fixed fortifications. The effectiveness of the German defense was a testament to the tactical skill of the Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, whose tenacity and discipline maximized the defensive advantage of the terrain. Compelling evidence. The primary defenders of the Gustav Line's anchor points were units of the 1st Parachute Division and other veteran units, highly trained in defensive warfare and close-quarters fighting. These troops expertly utilized the flooded dikes, ditches, and fortified farmhouses as natural bunkers, holding their ground against overwhelming Allied manpower and massive artillery bombardments. Insightful expert quote, "The paratroopers' doctrine emphasized fierce, non-yielding defense, forcing the Allied infantry to use extreme measures, such as flamethrowers and hand-to-hand combat, to clear positions that would normally have been neutralized by conventional shelling." Vivid example. The Germans frequently launched fierce, localized counterattacks during the night and in poor visibility, denying the Canadian and British forces time to consolidate their small gains on the narrow dikes and inflicting severe, often surprising casualties. The rich explanation for their effectiveness is their discipline. The Fallschirmjäger fought to the absolute last man, minimizing the rate of surrender and ensuring that every tactical objective had to be physically secured under fire, maximizing the statistical reality of Allied attrition. The German paratroopers' resolve turned the Scheldt into a monument to defensive attrition. The logistical dependency created by the German flooding was a unique constraint that governed every aspect of the Canadian and British ground operation for 5 weeks. Compelling evidence. The widespread, deliberate inundation of the polders meant that virtually all transport of personnel, ammunition, food, and casualty evacuation had to be performed by specialized amphibious vehicles, LVTs and DUKWs. This dramatically slowed the pace of the advance. Heavy tanks and conventional trucks, which provided the Allied offensive advantage, were immobilized in the deep mud, reducing the operation to the speed of the infantry and the vulnerable amphibious transports. Insightful expert quote, "The logistical challenge was immense. Specialized engineer units had to continuously repair breaches in the temporary causeways and dikes under fire just to maintain the single fragile line of supply to the advancing infantry." Vivid example. Casualty evacuation was particularly perilous. Wounded soldiers had to be transported across vast stretches of flooded land in the open beds of amphibious vehicles, making them vulnerable to sustained German mortar and sniper fire. The rich explanation for the German strategic success in using water is that they effectively neutralized the Allied mechanized advantage. By forcing the Allies to fight on waterlogged ground, they reduced the conflict to an infantry versus infantry slog, prolonging the battle dramatically. The German use of water as a weapon was a masterstroke that dictated the entire Allied operational tempo. The clearing of the German minefields, a perilous, unglamorous task, represented the single greatest technological and human sacrifice demanded of the Allied Engineer Corps. Compelling evidence. The German forces had seeded the land and water routes of the Scheldt with an immense quantity of mines, including anti-personnel S-mines and anti-tank mines, often laid in densely patterned, overlapping fields across the dikes and beaches. Canadian engineer platoons faced devastating casualty rates, crawling across the mud under fire to locate and disarm these sophisticated devices, confirming the high price of logistical clearance. Insightful expert, quote, "The subsequent naval clearance of the Estuary, after the land battles were over, was an equally dangerous undertaking, with 2,000 naval mines having to be meticulously swept by Canadian and British minesweepers before the port could be deemed safe for Allied shipping." Vivid example. The naval mine clearance operation was complicated by the strong tides and the fact that German coastal batteries, though silenced, had to be checked for booby traps and remaining snipers, confirming the continued peril of the task. The rich explanation for the minefield strategy is the German goal of delay. The mines were laid not to win the battle, but to guarantee that even after the German troops withdrew, the strategic objective, Antwerp, would remain logistically unusable for weeks, buying time for the main German front to regroup. The engineers' sacrifice was the final, unseen price paid to turn the port of Antwerp into an operational lifeline. The immense strategic pressure exerted by General WW2 Eisenhower confirmed the Scheldt operation's singular status as the most critical logistical battle of the entire Western Front in 1944. Compelling evidence, Eisenhower issued explicit directives confirming that securing the port of Antwerp was the absolute priority, even over the immediate pursuit of German forces across the Rhine. The lengthening supply lines, stretching hundreds of miles from Normandy to the front, were collapsing under the weight of the massive Allied army, leading to severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and winter supplies at the front line. Insightful expert quote, "The failure of Operation Market Garden, September 1944, to secure a quick bridgehead across the Rhine further intensified the need for Antwerp, confirming that the short-term tactical failure had led to a long-term logistical crisis." Vivid example. The Allied dependence on the Red Ball Express truck convoy system, which struggled to move the necessary 1,000 tons of supplies daily, made the deep-water, rail-connected port of Antwerp an existential necessity at its time. The rich explanation for the command focus is the sheer size of the Allied army. Sustaining millions of men and their mechanized equipment required a maritime logistical hub that only Antwerp could provide, overriding all other tactical considerations for 2 months. The strategic necessity of the port governed every single tactical decision made throughout the 5-week battle. The deployment of specialized engineer assault vehicles, the funnies, of the 79th Armored Division was a decisive factor in breaching the strong points on Walcheren Island and the mainland. Compelling evidence. Units of the 79th Armored Division deployed unique tanks designed specifically to overcome fortifications and mines, including Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tanks and AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers demolition tanks. The flamethrower tanks were vital for clearing German paratroopers from deeply entrenched concrete bunkers and log positions that were impervious to conventional anti-tank fire. Insightful expert quote, "The funnies were created by Major General Percy Hobart based on the lessons of the Dieppe raid, confirming that specialized armor was required to breach complex defensive systems like the Atlantic Wall." Vivid example. The AVRE tanks carried massive demolition charges to blast holes in concrete bunkers and obstacles, providing the breaching capacity that the infantry alone could not achieve against the German fortifications. The rich explanation for the specialized armor is the German defensive mastery. Since the enemy exploited every terrain feature, the Allies needed dedicated, specialized equipment to counter each specific type of fixed defense, bunkers, water, mines. The technological edge provided by the funnies saved immense infantry casualties during the fortress assaults. The high Canadian casualty rate confirmed the brutal, close-quarters nature of the fighting, which contrasted sharply with the fluid maneuver warfare seen earlier in the campaign. Compelling evidence. The Canadian Army sustained over 6,300 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing in the Scheldt operation, primarily during the relentless frontal assaults across the narrow, confined South Beveland Peninsula and the Breskens Pocket. The battle was defined by brutal infantry attrition, where the Canadian troops were repeatedly forced to cross open ground under fire, leaving them vulnerable to the concentrated machine gun and mortar positions zeroed in by the German paratroopers. Insightful expert quote, "The casualty rate was disproportionately high because the flooded terrain prevented the effective use of tanks and heavy vehicles to support the infantry, forcing the fighting back to small unit hand-to-hand engagements." Vivid example. The Canadian troops' relentless, disciplined advance under fire, despite the horrific conditions and high losses, was a testament to their fighting resolve and the strategic imperative to clear the route to Antwerp. The rich explanation for the specific national burden is the geographical assignment. The 1st Canadian Army was geographically tasked with clearing the entire estuary, ensuring they bore the brunt of the attrition needed to secure the choke point. The Canadian sacrifice was the highest proportional price paid for the logistical salvation of the Western Front. The eventual opening of the port of Antwerp marked a psychological as well as a logistical turning point for the Allies, guaranteeing the resources necessary to continue the final drive into Germany. Compelling evidence. When the first Allied convoy, led by the Canadian-built freighter SS Estuary, finally sailed into the harbor on November 28, 1944, it signaled the end of the immediate logistical crisis. The port immediately began handling the vast quantities of fuel, food, and ammunition required by the frontline armies, confirming the strategic necessity of the bloody, 5-week battle. Insightful expert quote, "The psychological lift for the Allied High Command and the frontline troops was immense. The crisis was averted, and the resource flow was secured, allowing planners to proceed with preparations for the final push into the German industrial heartland, the Ruhr." Vivid example. The German counterattack in the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, launched just weeks later, was initially aimed at recapturing Antwerp. The German High Command recognized the port's strategic value until the very end of the war in the West. The rich explanation for the port's value is its infrastructure. Antwerp possessed massive docking facilities, cranes, and an intact rail network that could immediately receive and distribute supplies at a scale unmatched by any other captured port in the West. The opening of Antwerp secured the logistical foundation for the final Allied victory. The Battle of the Scheldt stands as a final, comprehensive lesson in the indispensable, though often unglamorous, role of logistics, engineering, and attrition in winning a mechanized war. Compelling evidence. The 5-week battle confirmed that even brilliant tactical victories, like the breakout for Normandy, are unsustainable without equally brilliant logistical support. The battle was a triumph of engineer ingenuity and infantry attrition over brilliant defensive terrain, demonstrating that war's most critical objective can sometimes be a geographical choke point or a port, not a capital city. Insightful expert quote, "The Scheldt proved that the final phase of the war would be a relentless, attritional grind against a determined enemy fighting on its own soil, demanding continuous sacrifice and engineering resourcefulness." Vivid example. The strategic importance of the battle is often overshadowed by flashier operations like the Battle of the Bulge, yet without the port of Antwerp, the Allied armies would have been paralyzed and the Bulge counterattack far more successful. The rich explanation for the battle's legacy is its lack of glory but immense necessity. It was a logistical solution purchased with blood, ensuring the eventual victory on the Western Front by solving the crisis of supply. The Battle of the Scheldt remains a somber example of attrition as the indispensable foundation of victory. The final opening of the port of Antwerp confirmed the immense strategic importance of the operation, providing the logistical foundation necessary for the remainder of the Allied offensive into Germany. Compelling evidence. When the first Allied convoy, led by the Canadian-built freighter SS Estuary, finally sailed into the harbor on November 28, 1944, it signaled the definitive end of the Western Front's most critical supply crisis. The port immediately began handling the vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and food needed to sustain the 3 Allied army groups, confirming its status as the non-negotiable logistical hub. Insightful expert quote, "The port's operational capacity provided the necessary throughput for the final, massive push towards the Rhine and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Without Antwerp, the Allied offensive would have been paralyzed and forced into a strategic defensive posture." Vivid example. The successful, if delayed, opening of Antwerp provided the critical cushion of supplies that allowed the Allies to weather and ultimately defeat the subsequent German counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulkirk, Wanner-Au, which was launched just weeks later. The rich explanation for the port's value is its infrastructure. Antwerp possessed massive docking facilities and an intact rail network that could immediately receive and distribute supplies at a scale unmatched by any other captured port in the West. The opening of Antwerp was the climax of the logistical war, guaranteeing the final victory on the Western Front. The extensive use of engineer units and specialized equipment confirmed the Scheldt as a unique triumph of technical warfare over formidable defensive obstacles. Compelling evidence. The primary obstacles were the deliberate flooding and the dense fields of mines. Engineers were continuously engaged, using flamethrower carriers, wasps to clear bunkers, and specialized demolition charges to breach fortified positions. The naval clearance operation was a massive undertaking, with Canadian and British minesweepers removing over 2,000 naval mines that had been laid to prevent shipping access, confirming the battle's high technological barrier to entry. Insightful expert, quote, "The battle necessitated the permanent integration of Major General Percy Hobart's funnies, specialized armored vehicles into standard assault doctrine, validating the principle that highly specialized engineering equipment is vital for breaching complex static defenses. Vivid example. The successful use of LVTs, landing vehicles tracked, which alone could traverse the flooded polders, demonstrated the necessity of adapting equipment to neutralize the Germans' environmental warfare strategy. The rich explanation for the technical victory is that the Germans created an excellent defensive puzzle. The Allies' victory lay in finding and implementing the correct, highly specialized engineering solutions to solve that puzzle, often at immense cost to the engineer personnel. The Scheldt proved that technical superiority was essential for defeating a determined, entrenched enemy. The battle exposed the profound ethical and environmental cost of modern total war, particularly through the use of deliberate environmental destruction by both sides. Compelling evidence. The German forces systematically destroyed the dikes to create intentional, massive flooding, using water as a weapon to slow the Allied advance and preserve their defensive positions. The Allied response was even more drastic. The Royal Air Force RAF deliberately breached the seawalls of Walcheren Island with heavy bombs, causing the catastrophic, purposeful inundation of the entire island to neutralize the German coastal batteries. Insightful expert, quote, "This mutual use of water and terrain as a destructive weapon confirmed that the conflict's intensity had blurred the lines between combat and environmental warfare, prioritizing military necessity over the integrity of the land and the welfare of the local Dutch and Belgian populations." Vivid example. The flooding severely impacted the local civilian population and agricultural land, creating a massive post-war reconstruction and drainage effort that added to the long-term cost of the conflict. The rich explanation for this environmental dimension is the strategic value of the terrain. Since the German defense was built on manipulating the Dutch polder system, the Allies had no choice but to escalate the environmental damage to achieve their non-negotiable strategic objective, Antwerp. The immense use of environmental warfare confirmed the desperation and total commitment of both sides. The protracted 5-week engagement had a direct, measurable influence on the timing and success of the subsequent Ardennes offensive, Battle of the Bulge. Compelling evidence. The German 15th Army's successful delaying action prevented the port of Antwerp from becoming operational until late November. This critical delay exacerbated the Allied supply shortage and hampered the ability to amass reserves for the winter. The delay gave the German High Command crucial time, nearly a month, to stockpile fuel and materiel and prepare the massive counteroffensive that surprised the Allies in the Ardennes in December 1944. Insightful expert, quote, "The heavy attrition suffered by the 1st Canadian Army meant that the units involved were severely depleted and not fully rested or refitted when the Battle of the Bulge struck, confirming the long-term drain on Allied manpower." Vivid example. The German counterattack in the Ardennes was explicitly aimed at recapturing the port of Antwerp, confirming that even months later, the German High Command recognized the port's immense strategic value as the ultimate choke point for the entire Allied advance. The rich explanation for the connection is the zero-sum nature of the delay. Every day the Canadian Army was stuck in the mud of the Scheldt. The German forces gained time to reorganize and prepare their surprise counterpunch, a high price paid for the logistical solution. The Scheldt's cost was paid twice. once in Attrition and again in the shock of the Ardennes counterattack. The Battle of the Scheldt remains a crucial, though often overlooked, testament to the unglamorous necessity of attrition and logistics in winning a highly mobile, mechanized war. Compelling evidence. The 5-week battle confirmed that brilliant tactical maneuver, the breakout from Normandy, is strategically meaningless without equally brilliant logistical capacity. The port of Antwerp, the immense 12,800 Allied casualties, confirmed that the final phase of the war would be a hard, unrelenting grind against a determined, well-entrenched enemy, demanding continuous sacrifice and engineering resourcefulness. Insightful expert quote, "The battle confirmed the principle that the highest strategic priority can sometimes be the least glamorous objective, a geographical choke point or a port and not a capital city." Vivid example. The strategic importance of the battle is often overshadowed by the later, more dramatic events like the Battle of the Bulge, yet without the opening of Antwerp, the Allied armies would have been paralyzed by the supply crisis. The rich explanation for the battle's enduring legacy is its confirmation of the war's ultimate foundation, massive industrial output and the logistical capacity to deploy that output onto the battlefield, a foundation purchased by the blood and tenacity of the Canadian, British, and supporting forces. The Battle of the Scheldt stands as a somber example of attrition as the indispensable prerequisite for ultimate victory.